In the flickering gaslight of a Victorian London parlor, a family gathers for a portrait. The parents sit stiffly, their expressions somber and formal, while their young daughter rests peacefully in her mother's lap, her eyes closed as if in a deep, dreamless sleep. But there is a chilling detail that a modern observer might miss, something that turns this domestic scene into a nightmare. The child isn't sleeping. She has been dead for 2 days. This is the world of post-mortem photography, a custom so unsettling to our modern sensibilities that it remains one of the most misunderstood and haunting rituals of the 19th century. To understand why Victorian Londoners were obsessed with photographing the dead, you have to realize that in 1860, death wasn't something hidden away in sterile hospitals. It was a constant, intimate guest in every household. Disease, poor sanitation, and the bone bread that plagued the slums meant that child mortality was staggeringly high.
For many families, a person's death occurred in the very same bed where they were born. But as the Industrial Revolution gave rise to the middle class, a new technology emerged that offered a desperate way to fight back against the cold permanence of loss: the camera. The ritual of the mourning portrait was born out of a profound, visceral need for a tangible memory. In an age before selfies or digital storage, a photograph was a rare and expensive luxury. Often, a family wouldn't think to have a portrait taken while everyone was healthy. When a child died suddenly of scarlet fever or cholera, the parents realized with a jolt of horror that they had no visual record of the face they loved. The photographer was called not to document a corpse, but to capture a soul before it vanished forever in the London fog. The techniques used to create these living images were as ingenious as they were macabre. Victorian photographers were masters of a dark illusion.
They didn't want a gruesome record of decay. They wanted a masterpiece of the last sleep. If the deceased had just passed, they might be posed on a sofa, surrounded by their favorite toys or fresh lilies. To make them appear alive, photographers would sometimes prop the eyelids open, or, more chillingly, paint pupils directly onto the closed eyelids or onto the finished photographic plate. A rosy tint was often added to the cheeks in post-production to mimic the healthy flush of life, creating a ghost that looked more vibrant than the grieving survivors.
But as the custom evolved, the posing became more elaborate and physically demanding. For an American audience used to the open casket viewing, the Victorian standing portrait is where the true discomfort lies. Using heavy iron stands, hidden behind curtains or the deceased's own heavy clothing, photographers would literally bolt the body into a standing position. They would pose a dead father with his hand on his son's shoulder, or a dead wife standing by the fireplace as if waiting for tea. In these photos, the living often looked more dead than the deceased. Because the exposure times were so long, the living family members would slightly blur as they breathed, while the dead remained perfectly, terrifyingly still and sharp. Why did they do this? It wasn't because they were creepy or obsessed with the macabre. It was an act of profound, desperate love.
In a city like London, where life was cheap and the smog of coal smoke seemed to erase people from existence, a photograph was a way to say, this person mattered. They wanted to remember their loved ones as they were, not as a body in a wooden box. By posing them as if they were still part of the family circle, they were attempting to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the silent, growing world of the grave. It was a rebellion against the finality of the Victorian era's high mortality rates. The post-mortem ritual also served a vital social function. These photos weren't hidden away in a drawer. They were often turned into memorial cards and mailed to distant relatives across the empire. Imagine opening your mail in 1880 and finding a high-quality print of your late nephew looking back at you with hand-painted eyes. To the Victorians, this was a gift of comfort and connection.
It allowed the extended family to meet the deceased one last time, acknowledging their place in the lineage. It was a shared social currency of grief that helped a mourning society process the sheer, overwhelming volume of death that surrounded them daily. However, there is a darker layer to this custom that historians are only now fully exposing. As the 19th century progressed, the death photo became a massive, lucrative industry.
Specialized photographers marketed themselves as experts in the departed, charging extra for the delicate, often gruesome work of posing a cold, stiff limb into a natural, lifelike gesture. They used chemicals to slow down the visible signs of decomposition during the grueling session. The studio room would be filled with the heavy, cloying scent of lilies and lavender, not just for the ritual, but to mask the undeniable physical reality of the body sitting under the hot, intense studio lights. For a modern observer, the horror isn't just in the presence of the dead body, it's in the denial of death itself. We see a society that refused to let go, that used technology to create a beautiful lie.
But for a mother in a London slum who had lost 4 children in a single brutal winter, that lie was the only thing that kept her tethered to reality. The photo was a shield against the miasma and the great dust that tried to turn her children into forgotten statistics in a ledger. It was a way to keep her family whole, even if only on a piece of chemically treated paper. As the 20th century approached and cameras became cheaper and more common, the post-mortem trend began to fade into obscurity. Death became medicalized, moved out of the home and into the cold funeral parlor. We began to fear the dead, viewing them as a source of infection rather than a member of the household. The standing portraits were eventually tucked away in attics, becoming the creepy artifacts we find today in antique shops, mysterious figures with eyes that don't quite look right, staring out from a London that no longer exists.
They are the silent witnesses to a time when love was stronger than the fear of the grave. The story of Victorian death photography is a powerful reminder that the way we grieve is always shaped by the tools we have at our disposal. They used the cutting-edge technology of their day to perform an ancient, universal human ritual, the refusal to forget. They stood the dead on iron poles and painted life onto their cold, unmoving eyes, because the alternative, the total, silent erasure of their existence, was too much for the human heart to bear. It was a technical solution to an emotional catastrophe.
So, when you look at one of these old sepia-toned photos and feel a sudden shiver down your spine, remember that you aren't looking at a horror movie prop or a Gothic curiosity. You are looking at a family's most prized and expensive possession. You are looking at the final, desperate attempt of a Victorian Londoner to hold on to a hand that had already turned to ice. It's a custom that no one explains right because we are too scared to admit that we might do the very same thing if we were surrounded by that much sudden and tragic loss. The Victorians didn't take pictures of the dead because they loved death. They took them because they loved life so much they couldn't stand to see it end without a trace. They turned the camera into a spiritual bridge, and for a few long seconds of exposure time, they made the dead live again. It was a beautiful, terrifying, and ultimately heartbreaking deception, the ultimate Victorian secret, hidden behind a painted smile and a stiffly posed frame.
In the end, London's post-mortem culture stands as a final testament to the human heart's incredible resilience. In a city of shadows, fog, and bone bread, they found a way to bring a little bit of light to the darkest moment a family can face. They didn't just photograph the dead, they immortalized the love that refused to let them go into the dark alone. Every line in these portraits tells a story of a life cut short and a memory preserved by force. The iron stands, the painted eyes, and the heavy drapes were all part of a theater of grief that allowed the living to say goodbye on their own terms. It was a world where the dead were still present, still part of the conversation, and still deserving of a place on the mantle. This was the true face of Victorian London, a city where the boundary between life and death was as thin as a photograph, and where the dead were never truly gone as long as someone held their image in their hands.